They tried to destroy the very career I spent a lifetime building, completely unaware that the person holding the power to end theirs was me. It sounds like something out of a made-up drama, but it unfolded just a few months ago in real life, and the people pulling the strings weren't some competitors or a bitter old boss. They were my own parents and my younger brother, the same boy I once fed, clothed, and coached through his first job interview. My name is Margaret Lynn. I'm 56 and I live in Portland, Oregon, a place I used to think of as safe, as home. But life has a cruel way of teaching you that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from people who know exactly where your wounds are, because they're the ones who put them there. My husband passed when our kids were still young. Since then, I've stood alone. I didn't wait for chances, I made them. I built 3 businesses, failed twice, and finally succeeded on the 3rd try. Enough to live quietly, without fanfare. But in all that silence, somehow my family mistook dignity for weakness. They whispered behind closed doors, spread rumors, forged lies, hoping to push me out of the very company I founded with my bare hands. What they didn't know was that I'd been listening, watching, preparing. Because there's one thing people born into comfort never understand. When someone who's been underestimated, their entire life finally rises. They don't need to raise their voice, they just reveal the truth. And that's enough to make the whole room fall silent. 18 years ago, I was just another quiet girl on scholarship at the University of Michigan, studying biomedical sciences while working night shifts in the hospital's research lab, and teaching assistant roles just to cover rent and groceries. There were no safety nets, no weekend visits home, and certainly no vacations. I didn't complain, not because it was easy, but because I believed the hardship would lead somewhere worth going. Meanwhile, my younger brother, Brian, waltzed through Duke University, fully funded by our parents who didn't hesitate to shower him with every resource. He had a car before he needed a license, spent summers abroad, and was constantly praised for simply staying out of trouble. I remember my mother's voice over the phone, the way she'd say, "You've always been so independent, Maggie. Brian just needs a bit more support." But independence wasn't a choice. It was the only path I had. I spent my 20s hustling beneath the surface, launching side businesses, consulting for labs, and even teaching coding on weekends. There were no newspaper features or shiny LinkedIn posts. Every dollar I earned was reinvested, every mistake absorbed silently, and every step forward was taken alone. I had launched 2 biotech ventures by the time I turned 30. One failed spectacularly, and the other I sold in silence under a shell company. Because by then I had learned that success, when visible, attracts not only admiration but envy, especially from those closest to you. My family never really understood what I did. In their eyes, Brian's steady job in pharmaceutical sales was the real career, respectable, easy to explain at cocktail parties. My research, my innovations, even my company shares were viewed as hobbies, as nice projects that might one day lead somewhere, if I was lucky. I remember sitting at our Thanksgiving table while Brian explained commission structures like he'd discovered Wall Street, and my parents hung on every word. When I mentioned a clinical trial my lab had secured with the NIH, my father simply asked, "But does that pay well?" So, I let them believe I needed help. I let them think I was just getting by. Because sometimes it's safer to be underestimated. Behind the scenes, I began a quiet, strategic acquisition of Ardmore Biologics, a mid-sized but undervalued research firm in Seattle, where I had taken a senior position under the name M. Lynn, just vague enough to go unnoticed, just obscure enough to operate freely. Through a carefully constructed network of trusts and holding entities, I began purchasing shares, bit by bit, week after week, until I became the controlling owner. No one suspected a thing, not my colleagues, not the board, and certainly not my family. When I was promoted to Chief Strategy Officer, they assumed I had finally caught a lucky break. Brian even joked that I must have known someone on the inside. My mother smiled and said, Well, maybe now you can get some real business advice from your brother. He's been managing people for years, you know. I said nothing, but in that moment, as they chuckled at my expense, I knew I had reached the point of no return. I wasn't just building a company anymore, I was building the proof. The undeniable proof that I had never needed their approval, only their silence. What they didn't realize was that the game they were playing, whispers, dismissals, passive insults, was about to be flipped upside down. Because they weren't undermining some struggling sister still chasing dreams, they were provoking the owner. At first, the signs were subtle, easily dismissed if I hadn't already learned to read between the lines. A senior researcher casually mentioned that my brother had stopped by the office, just to catch up, though he hadn't told me he was in town. Later that week, someone from accounting mentioned how thoughtful Brian had been, dropping off lunch for the department and making light conversation about company leadership transitions. He always had a charm to him, a way of cloaking ambition in concern, but I recognized the pattern. He was probing for cracks. What unsettled me wasn't that he was meddling, but that he was doing it so confidently, as if he had every right to question my role, to insinuate that I might be unfit. At family dinners, he doubled down on that posture, dropping veiled remarks about how strategy isn't just about spreadsheets and how people skills can't be learned in a lab. My parents, sitting on either side of him, nodded along, smiling politely in my direction, never once questioning his tone. Then the anonymous emails began. The first was a vague HR complaint. Nothing specific, just a whisper of falsified credentials and misalignment with company culture. It was easily dismissed. The second carried a forged resume, supposedly showing discrepancies in my degrees. The third was more elaborate, a tip to the compliance team suggesting insider trading. Again, all false. But the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was planting seeds of doubt, hoping something would stick. When I confronted Brian in the parking lot after our father's birthday dinner, his face registered only mild surprise. He didn't deny anything. He simply tilted his head, gave me that half smile he'd perfected since childhood, and said, "Maggie, you know how fast companies move these days. It's all about diversity optics and fast promotions. I'm just worried you're in over your head. I'd hate to see you crash in front of people who matter." I remember standing there staring at my own brother, realizing that he had never truly seen me. Not as capable, not as deserving, and certainly not as a leader. His words weren't born of concern but resentment. He couldn't reconcile the idea that I, the sister who had quietly paid her way through school, who had stayed up nights writing grant proposals while he partied through his 20s, was now the one holding the reins. Still, I said nothing, because sometimes silence is more powerful than any retort. But he didn't stop. A week later, the board received a thick envelope, addressed anonymously, but clearly orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of my professional timeline. Inside were fabricated bank statements, doctored email threads, and accusations so meticulously presented, they would have looked convincing to anyone who didn't know better. The implication? That I had embezzled funds, manipulated financial reports, and engaged in insider misconduct. The board immediately called for an emergency meeting. My assistant whispered the news to me late Thursday afternoon, her voice shaking, eyes wide with disbelief. She didn't know yet what I already suspected, that this wasn't just an opportunistic attack, it was premeditated, coordinated, and personal. That night, over another silent family meal, Brian's smile was practically glowing. He leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, and announced, "I've been invited to sit in on a big board session tomorrow. Can't say much, but it's probably going to be a leadership shake-up." My parents clapped softly, beaming with pride, never once looking at me, not even a question about why I, the actual executive, wasn't involved in this so-called big meeting. But I let them celebrate. I watched them toast to what they believed would be my undoing, and I stayed silent. Not because I was defeated, but because I knew something they didn't. While they were preparing for my fall, I was preparing to show them how far I had already risen. That night, after my brother raised his glass to a future he thought belonged to him, I returned home to a quiet house that had witnessed every late-night plan, every whispered doubt, and every document I had ever tucked away, not out of fear, but out of foresight. I poured myself a glass of water, no celebration, no tears, and sat at the same desk where I had, piece by piece, constructed the architecture of my comeback long before they ever saw me as a threat. The envelope Brian had sent the board was meticulously assembled, but I had seen enough boardrooms to know that the most dangerous lies are the ones that look almost true. I spent that night unsealing my own folders, not with panic but with precision. Financial records, time-stamped correspondences, emails, video calls, legal filings, and ownership documents. Everything. If they wanted to question my integrity, I would give them the full anatomy of the truth, layer by layer, irrefutable and complete. But this wasn't just about defense. It was about clarity. I drafted a confidential briefing and sent it to each board member through encrypted channels, accompanied by a single line in the email subject. For tomorrow's meeting, please review before 9 a.m. Inside, I detailed not only the falsehoods embedded in Brian's attack, but also the full legal structure of Ardmore Biologics' ownership. The company they thought was still held in fragmented investor stakes had, 2 months earlier, been acquired outright by a private trust, Hollingsworth Equity, a name with no public trace to me, but one I had quietly built over years with the help of discreet counsel and absolute patience. Through that entity, I now owned 84% of the company. The remaining 16% was split across loyal senior partners, none of whom had been swayed by Brian's backroom charm. As dawn crept across the sky, I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. I had spent too many nights over the years pushing through far worse, with no applause, no help, and no promises. What was one more sleepless night if it meant finally telling the story in full? By 7 a.m., my assistant Lena had received instructions to prepare hard copies of the board packets, each bound, tabbed, and stamped with documentation, verifying the chain of ownership and the fabricated nature of every accusation. I had also included audio recordings. Yes, I had them, captured through office-wide compliance systems and flagged over the past 3 weeks by internal security. In those recordings, Brian's voice was crystal clear, gently suggesting that my leadership lacked maturity, nudging employees to double-check department finances, and planting doubt with the practiced ease of someone who had done it many times before, just never with someone who recorded it all. It wasn't vindictiveness that drove me to prepare with such meticulous care. It was resolve. I needed the board to see the full picture, not just to clear my name, but to understand what they were truly dealing with. Still, part of me wished it hadn't come to this, that I hadn't needed to weaponize truth just to hold the position I had earned through sweat and sacrifice. But I also knew that if I backed down now, I wouldn't just lose a title. I would lose the quiet dignity I had carried all these years, the strength to endure in silence when recognition never came, and the authority to stand, not with vengeance, but with unwavering truth. At 8:45 that morning, I arrived at Ardmore Biologics early, not to hide in my office, but to observe from above as the final act began to unfold. From the window, I saw Brian walk in, his suit sharp, his gait confident, our parents just steps behind him, dressed for the kind of victory they thought was theirs by birthright. They smiled at the receptionist. They thought they belonged here. What they didn't know was that I had invited them. Every person in that room was about to learn what happens when the one you dismissed, the one you overlooked, and the one you tried to erase turns out to be the one who owns the ground you're standing on. At precisely 9 a.m., I pushed back from my desk, collected the final folder, and made my way down the executive hallway with the same measured pace I had walked 1,000 times before. But this time, I wasn't carrying data or budgets or strategy briefs. I was carrying truth, and I wasn't alone. My assistant Lena waited just outside the boardroom, calm and composed, her hands clutching the folders that would quietly dismantle every lie Brian had spun. Inside, the air was dense with anticipation. Marcus Glenn, our board chair, stood at the head of the long oak table mid-sentence, reading solemnly from the envelope Brian had so confidently delivered. Words like embezzlement, fraud, and insider trading hung in the room like a heavy fog. Brian sat toward the center, perfectly poised, his hands clasped like a man already savoring the victory he thought was inevitable. I opened the door. Heads turned. The room fell still. Brian's smile faltered for just a second before snapping back into place, though his eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite suppress. Discomfort. "Apologies for the delay," I said calmly, taking the empty seat at the far end of the table. "I thought it might be best if the owner of this company were present during such an important discussion." The silence that followed was almost melodic. Brian's jaw tightened. My mother blinked as though she had misheard. My father looked away, suddenly preoccupied with his cufflink. "This is a closed session," Brian said quickly, his voice rising just a note above its usual register. "You weren't invited." "I invited myself," I replied, folding my hands. "And more importantly, I have every legal right to be here." Lena stepped forward, distributing folders to each board member. As they opened the packets, eyes widened. Some gasped audibly. The documents were clear, irrefutable, and signed. Hollingsworth Equity, the trust that had acquired Ardmore Biologics 2 months earlier, was fully owned and controlled by me. The paper trail, audited and notarized, left no doubt. Brian stammered something about public shareholders and ownership structures, but the board was already reading, absorbing the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. I turned to Marcus, nodding for the next step. Lena tapped her tablet, and then the room filled with Brian's voice, recorded, archived, and now echoing back at him through the speakers in crisp detail. "Maggie's not exactly leadership material," followed by, "Have you checked her department's financials? Might be worth a look." Another clip played, this time dripping with false concern. "Honestly, I think the company would be better off with someone more stable, someone with real management experience." Each statement was carefully time-stamped, each source traceable, each moment building a picture not of concern, but of calculated sabotage. Brian's expression shifted from disbelief to desperation. His chair creaked as he leaned forward, his hands now trembling. Then I pulled out the final piece. "This," I said, holding up the original envelope he had sent the board, "contains forged documents, fabricated financial statements, and deliberately manipulated emails. Not only is this an attempt to defame me, it also puts the company at significant legal risk, and I have reason to believe you were not acting alone." My mother spoke first, her voice brittle. "You wouldn't really ruin your brother's life over this, would you?" I looked at her, long and hard, not with anger, but with a sadness that came from too many years of being dismissed. "Did you pause when you thought he might ruin mine?" My father mumbled something about support and misunderstanding, but I didn't let it land. I turned to the board again. "I want it on record that the board has fully reviewed and dismissed all allegations against me, based on verified documentation and internal investigation. Furthermore, I am requesting a formal letter be sent to Mr. Brian Lynn's current employer, disclosing his conduct, including the recorded attempts at corporate espionage." Brian tried to interject, his voice cracking. "You're destroying my career. Don't you see that?" "No," I said softly. "You did that yourself. The difference is, I have evidence. You had ambition without integrity. And now you'll be remembered not for what you built, but for what you tried to tear down." There was one last folder in my briefcase, and as I placed it on the table, I saw something shift behind my parents' eyes. Recognition, maybe even regret. "This," I said, "is the acquisition contract from my first company, sold at 29 for $42 million. This next one, I added, sliding another folder forward, was sold 3 years later for $185 million. I could have flaunted it. I could have bought the lake house Dad wanted, or paid off Brian's college loans without him even knowing. But I stayed quiet, because I wanted to see who would stand beside me when they thought I had nothing. Brian had no more words. My mother was crying now, mascara streaking down her face, and my father sat slumped, smaller somehow, like the weight of years had just caught up to him. I stood. This meeting is adjourned. Marcus, please ensure that all materials are secured and formal statements filed. Brian, Mom, Dad, security will escort you out. You are no longer welcome on this property. Any attempt to interfere with staff or operations will result in legal escalation. I had barely reached the door when Brian called after me, his voice raw and hollow. Please. I was jealous. I didn't know how to handle you finally doing better than me. We're family, Maggie. Can't we fix this? I paused, turning just slightly. Do you know the difference between us, Brian? When I thought you were struggling, I protected your pride. When you thought I was succeeding, you tried to destroy me. Then I left. Not with vengeance, but with the kind of peace that only comes when the truth has done its job. The weeks that followed moved with a kind of quiet gravity, as if the air itself had settled differently in the halls of Ardmore Biologics. Brian was terminated from his position almost immediately after the board shared the recordings and documentation with his employer. There was no appeal, no rebuttal, just silence, the kind that hangs in the space left by someone who burned every bridge they thought they'd never need to cross again. Word spread slowly, first among internal teams, then across our industry. The woman they had once ignored at conference tables or mistaken for an assistant was now the CEO, whose story no one saw coming. And while I hadn't planned to go public, the truth has a way of making its way out when it's no longer a secret you need to keep for survival. Strangely, my phone began to ring more often, calls from people who had overlooked me for years, suddenly curious, cautiously respectful. Old acquaintances reached out under the guise of checking in, while others asked to be considered for board seats, consulting roles, even speaking opportunities. But I had no interest in applause from the same crowd that once called me invisible. I wasn't here for validation. I was here to build. My parents left voicemails too, hesitant, emotional, laced with familiar guilt. We didn't know the full story. We just wanted to support Brian. We're still your family. I listened to them only once before archiving them in a folder I named Proof of Distance. Not out of spite, but as a boundary I could see and respect. Some wounds don't need to bleed to remind you they were deep. 3 months later, I was working late when Lena buzzed in quietly. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Says it's personal." It was Brian. He looked thinner, worn in a way that wasn't physical but existential, like someone who had been living in the echo chamber of his own regret. No tailored jacket, no designer watch, just a plain shirt, an envelope in his hand, and a tremor in his voice as he said, "I'm not here to stay. I just wanted to leave this." He laid the envelope on my desk without ceremony. Inside were passwords, documents, and full disclosures of the tactics he'd used against me, meant for the board, for his former employer, and for anyone else he had tried to manipulate. It was, in his own words, an attempt to start over. "I know it doesn't fix anything," he said, "but I've taken an entry-level role at a startup in Spokane. No titles, no shortcuts. I'm learning for the first time what it means to earn something honestly. And I just wanted to say, letting me fail taught me more than any rescue ever could." He turned to leave, but I stopped him. Not with anger, not with absolution, but with clarity. "Brian," I said quietly, "send me your resume in a year." He blinked. "For a job?" "Not a leadership one," I replied. "But if you're serious about doing things the right way, we're always looking for people who are willing to work their way up." A tear slid down his cheek. Not dramatic, not performative, just human. He nodded, tucked his hands into his coat pockets, and walked out without asking for forgiveness. And that was the first time I believed he might truly change. 6 months later, Ardmore Biologics surpassed even our most ambitious projections. We expanded our research pipeline, opened 2 satellite labs across the Pacific Northwest, and launched a new clinical initiative focused on accessible treatment for underserved communities. We were no longer just profitable, we were purposeful. And I was no longer just surviving, I was finally living. My parents still send the occasional message, usually on holidays or when someone wants to brag about their daughter the CEO. I keep my responses polite but brief. The approval I once bent over backwards to earn no longer has a hold on me. Because when you've walked through fire alone and built something real, you no longer need people to clap, you need them to respect the silence you emerged from. Sometimes I sit in my office late at night, looking out over the city lights, thinking about the years I spent being doubted, dismissed, and deliberately held back. I think about the girl who used to wait for someone to open a door, not realizing she already had the keys in her hand. And I think about all the others out there, quiet, steady, and overlooked, who are still building their futures in the dark. To them, I say, keep going. You don't need noise to be powerful. You don't need praise to matter. And you certainly don't need permission to rise. Because real success isn't loud, it's earned. It's quiet, and once it arrives, it doesn't need to explain itself. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly working through pain no one else can see, I hope this gave you a reason to keep going. Like, comment, and subscribe if this resonated with you, because your story deserves to be heard too. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever risen quietly when no one believed in you? Let this space be more than a story. Let it be a reminder that even in silence, there is strength. This is your time. I'm listening, and so is the world.